is Ed Parker. I am a partner in our London office of Mayer Brown, and I'm the global head of derivatives and structured products. I have worked on emissions trading matters for many years, and so I'm delighted to be presenting today together with my partner Matt Kluchenik, who is a partner in our Chicago office in our derivatives practice. Matt's broad-based financial services practice counsels financial institutions, asset managers, trading advisors, fintech companies, multinational corporations, brokers, exchanges, and financial service technology providers with respect to regulatory transaction enforcement matters involving derivatives, securities, and cryptocurrencies, as well as focusing on enforcement investigations, regulations, and also being an expert in emissions trading matters, which we are discussing today. However, before we begin, we would like to cover a few housekeeping items. You were all muted upon entry to today's WebEx. Please do remain muted during the presentation. We will leave a bit of time at the end of each section for questions. Please feel free to send any of those through chat messaging, and we will do our best to answer those and indeed do that on a live basis. For those seeking CLE credit today, you should have received an affirmation form and an evaluation form along with the connection details. Please fill those out. We will announce the CLE code during the middle of the presentation and once at the end. Please return all forms for CLE credit to the Mayer Brown address provided on the forms. And with that, I would like to commence our presentation today. So, what are we going to cover? Well, today's talk is a mixture of what's going on not just in the finance world, but the Earth generally, how the finance world has sought to interact with that and be a force for good, a case of perhaps derivatives and other financial products saving the planet. So we're going to have a look at what's this all based on, the greenhouse effect, the Kyoto Protocol, the various mechanisms that the world of finance has brought in to deal with that, the CDM Project Cycle, the Joint Implementation Project Cycle, the phases of the European Union emissions trading scheme. Now, I know a lot of our listeners today are based in the United States, but what we are going through here may well be replicated nationally in the United States. Matt's going to talk about the possibilities for that. And of course, there are already various cap and trade schemes in place in the US already. But the EU scheme is very advanced, and so we'll cover some of the things that have been done, the standard documentation that's available, and the sort of products that are being used. So we will look at the use of derivatives in the carbon markets, how those are documented, and then Matt is going to look at the US emissions trading scheme framework, thoughts about how that may develop, and the regulation of the carbon trading market by the CFTC. So moving on to our next slide. This rather looks like one of my children's science projects, the sort of thing that anybody listening might see their son or daughter, our nieces, nephews bring home from school. And it's one of these graphs that shows how does the greenhouse effect work. And I think it is worth just having a look at this, because this is really what it's all based on, the idea that the sun passes through the Earth's atmosphere, the energy gets absorbed by greenhouse gases, some's reflected by the Earth's atmosphere and surface, and the rest is absorbed and warms the Earth's surface. Solar energy is then converted into heat, and the greenhouse gases send some of the infrared radiation back to the Earth's surface in the atmosphere. And as the Earth's surface gains more heat and infrared radiation is again emitted, some of that radiation passes through the atmosphere into space, but the more greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere, the more the Earth's temperature will increase, and that can have effect on climate. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the debates around that, but this premise is what is taken for international cooperation to try to amend the effect of the greenhouse effect. So moving on to the next slide, please. The Kyoto Protocol was signed back in 1992. Most of the world's countries were signatories to it, and the aim of the protocol was to reverse the effects of global warming. Now, some people will be surprised to know that the US was actually a signatory to the protocol, but the protocol was never ratified since 1992. However, most of the other countries in the world have ratified that, and they fall into 3 different sections. And this is very relevant for the types of emissions products that we have. So the first set of parties were called the Annex I parties, and this is these were the OECD countries in 1992, as well as 12 countries who were economies in transition. So the ones to note here is you had the European Union, Singapore, various other OECD countries. They fall into Annex I. They became obliged to adopt climate change strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The next set of parties were called the Annex II parties, and these were these were the Annex I parties less the economies in transition. So effectively the Russian Federation. So these Annex II parties, these are countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and the idea was that they would receive assistance from Annex I parties for technology transfer. So the reason for having this separation here at this point is a feeling of unfairness, that it's one thing for economies such as Spain, UK, France, Germany, to say we will reduce our emissions, but the Annex II parties, the Russian Federation at that time, say, well, that's not very fair because you've already developed your economies, so you're reducing from a higher base. But there were lots of factories and other producers that were high polluters, albeit that the overall levels of pollution were not particularly high. The other parties were the non-Annex I parties. Now, these were the developing nations, as they were then called, and these would be countries such as Algeria, many countries from Africa, countries from Asia that were categorized at that point, 1992, as developing nations. And there were no commitments for them to reduce the emissions levels, but there was an obligation for them to receive assistance to do so. So these 3 categorizations under the Kyoto Protocol, not necessarily correct categorizations looking at things through a lens of 2020, but this was through the lens of 1992 when the Kyoto Protocol was entered into. So this will become relevant in a moment, but just keep in mind the 3 lists of countries that are here. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. The Kyoto Protocol became adopted in 1997, so a few years along, and it focused on 6 greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. And the mixture of these gases make up the greenhouse gases, and the protocol's adherents accepted legally binding greenhouse gas emission reduction totals. So if we can move on to the next slide. Now, there were three mechanisms provided by the Kyoto Protocol to achieve these reductions. And these are very relevant depending on which category a country has been placed into. And these were the joint implementation, clean development mechanism, and cap and trade systems. Joint implementation is also known as JI, clean development mechanism as CDM, and cap and trade emissions trade systems as emissions trading. And what let's start with cap and trade systems first. So this allowed Annex 1 parties, such as those in the European Union, to create allowance units and trade them within an approved system. So what the European Union set up was an emissions trading scheme. And we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. But the European Union emissions trading scheme was an idea where the European Union would identify all of the various polluting institutions. So these could be steel makers, they could be glass makers, car manufacturers. And they would say, okay, here is a number of permits. And for each permit we give you, you have the right to pollute 1 ton of carbon dioxide, 1 ton of CO2. And let's say we give you, I'm just going to pluck out some numbers here for illustrative purposes. Let's say we have a glass manufacturer and it's generally polluted 100,000 tons of CO2 a year. So what the emissions trading scheme would do is say, well, here you are, glass manufacturer, here are 100,000 permits. Now, at the end of a particular year, you have to hand in 1 permit for every ton of CO2 you pollute. So if you pollute 100,000 tons of CO2, you have to put in 100,000 permits. If you pollute 120,000 tons of CO2, then you have to go out and buy 20,000 tons worth of 20,000 permits, 1 ton per permit. And if you pollute less than 100,000 tons of CO2, let's say it's only 80,000 tons of CO2, you could take 20,000 of your permits and sell them into the market to somebody else. And the idea is that there would be a value that would go up and down. If Europe has polluted too much, then the value, the rise in the value of permits goes, or the value of permits goes upwards, and it creates an economic incentive to pollute less. Now, the EU put all of its member states together and allocated how much there should be a reduction within for each member state. So overall, the EU had to reduce its amount of its emissions, but the UK had to move, and Germany had to, as having very industrialized economies, had to reduce far more than Spain. That at that point was a high growth economy, but hadn't reached the levels of Germany and Spain. So that was what was set up for a cap and trade system. There could have been cap and trade systems for any of these gases, but it was carbon that was chosen to be developed. Now, the clean development mechanism was set up for Annex 1 parties. So these are all the other countries in the world, apart from the OECD ones, other than the economies in transition as they occurred, which were effectively the CIS states. So although those countries had no obligation to reduce their levels of pollution, companies and others within the Annex 1 countries could go into these countries, launch projects, and if they were able to reduce the amount of pollution, they could earn permits in those markets, which they could use against their own obligations in the emissions trading scheme in the EU, or indeed sell those permits into the market. So we're going to look at an example of that in a moment, and these were called emissions reduction units. these could be then sold into the EU side of things, and a similar mechanism was set up for the Annex 1 parties, which were CIS, states, economies in transitions. Exactly the same principle, except emissions reductions here from projects were called certified emissions reductions. 1 permit for each ton of CO2 reduced, and these could be used in the EU emissions trading scheme. Now, of course, we're going to come on later to some of the arbitrage between those different units and the reasons for that, and the trading opportunities that could be created. So if we can move on to my next slide, please. So the Kyoto Protocol gave these various commitments to reduce emissions. The Annex 1 parties had to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by at least 5% overall. The European Union was treated as a single Annex 1 party, having to reduce its emissions target by 8%, although this allowed some member states I mentioned, such as Spain, to actually increase their emissions, whereas, and that was by as much as 15%, Portugal by 27%, whilst others had to reduce theirs greatly, such as Germany by 21% and the UK by 12.5%. But overall, that netted out at 8%. So on to my next slide, please. I wanted to give you an example of how the CDM project cycle works. It's a hypothetical example. It's one I created for these slides. And let's say we have a UK corporate, Nickel Industries. It's a major emitter of carbon dioxide, and it liaises with the Algerian Energy Ministry to upgrade Algeria's national grid. Now, Algeria is a non-Annex 1 party. It's ratified the Kyoto Protocol. So the project involves a technology transfer from the UK, which is an Annex 1 party, to Algeria, which is a non-Annex 1 party. And the Algerian project is going to make Algerian energy transfer more efficient, which will result in lower carbon dioxide emissions for Algeria. So Nickel Industry believes that this is going to make it qualify as a CDM project. Nickel is a participating installation in the EU emissions trading scheme. So as we said, it's a major polluter. It has to surrender allowances for all of its carbon dioxide emissions, but it hasn't been allocated enough emissions allowances compared to what it's actually polluting. So it's either got this alternative, go out into the open market, buy these allowances so it can submit enough of these, but instead it had this idea to plan to register the Algerian project as a CDM project and instead surrender some certified emissions reductions it generates to cover the allowances it will have to submit into the EU emissions trading scheme. So because of the risk of fraud, the risk of exaggeration, so there's quite a closely monitored process. There's a body called the CDM Executive Board. There would be an operational entity appointed by Nickel that would verify that any emissions saved meet the CDM criteria. The project would be registered, and over the measurement period, it would be measured the amount of pollution that has been saved through the project, and Nickel would get all one allowance for every ton of CO2 it had saved for being emitted. It would hand over a 2% levy of that, so it wouldn't get the full 100%, but it would get 98%, and then it would be able to use these permits that it has received as certified emission reductions and put these towards the allowances or that it has to submit in the EU. So could we move on to our next slide? Now on this slide, I'm giving an example of a joint implementation project. So this is one of the ones for the economies in transition. So let's have a look here. We've got the United Kingdom facing high emissions reductions costs and struggling to meet its Kyoto target, decides to invest in upgrading an old Soviet Union, Soviet era Ukrainian power plant with carbon dioxide emissions technology, and try to get it to achieve similar emissions reductions to one of its UK power plants. The project is successful and various emissions are saved. Ukraine would issue the United Kingdom with correspondent emission reduction units, which would count towards the UK's emission reduction target. So remember, this is at country level that the compliance needs to be, as well as any installations which have been given these permits as well. Now, if this had been done by a private company, for example, nickel industries, it would be exactly the same. These emissions credits could be used towards nickel industries allowances. Alternatively, the manager of that project could just sell the emissions reduction units or the certified CERs into the market to make a profit as well. So it's trying to change behaviors to make it profitable to reduce emissions rather than something that corporations would try to avoid doing in pursuit of profits. So moving on to the next slide. Emissions trading. So it's difficult to cover this in the right in the right order. So I've covered broadly emissions trading. Now let's start to look at this in a little bit more detail, because the three methods we've talked about are also closely linked. So emissions trading in the Kyoto Protocol is the third flexible mechanism for reducing emissions. As I mentioned, polluting installations are identified, they are given allowances, and they must submit a number of allowances at the end of the year. They can sell any, if they haven't polluted up to their allowance, they can sell any surplus into the market. If there's been an over pollution, they must go out and buy corresponding allowances. So let's move on to the next slide. The EU scheme has had 4 periods. Well, it's had 3 so far. We are about to move into a 4th one. So the first phase was from 1st of January 2005 until the end of 2007. Each phase, I find that people get very excited in the market. This is going to be a huge thing, emissions trading, it's going to be massive. And it's never quite reached the levels that people had thought that it would. Now, there's reasons for this. So this trial period was effectively a way to get the market to learn how to do this. There was generous allocations of emissions allowances to affected installations. And the idea was that the second phase, which is the compliance period of the Kyoto Protocol, i.e. when countries were obliged to reduce their emissions targets, was from the 1st of January 2008 till 31st December 2012. Now, at that point, the financial crisis hit. So naturally speaking, emissions levels fell, which meant that the cost of purchasing emissions allowances in the market fell to practically zero. And this killed off the market for some time. We moved to phase 3, which was from 2013 to 2020. There was a restriction in the number of allowances, which pushed up the value of allowances. There was debates about whether other greenhouse gases should be added, such as nitrous oxide, methane, and others. That didn't happen, but it was a strong debate. But the airlines were brought into the scheme as well, under much protest. Now, we are about to, from the 1st of January next year, go into a new phase where there's a major commitment to cut emissions levels for carbon dioxide to 43% from 2005 levels, with an annual 2.2% reduction. So this means that there are fewer permits that are allocated, which should push up the price of those permits, which should make for a more active market. So if we can move to my next slide. The first phase applied to energy activities with a thermal capacity of 20 megawatts. It hit the ferrous metals industry, minerals, pulp and paper production. My next slide, please. The second phase, I mentioned this compliance period, which ran only affecting CO2. There was an opt-in for other greenhouse gases, but that did not take place. And the non-compliance penalty. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned so far, of course, what happens if you have not been able to submit one permit for every CO2 ton that you pollute as one of these installations? Well, there's a penalty. Now, in phase one, it was 40 euros per ton. In phase two, it was 100 euros per ton. So there's a strong incentive to either reduce emissions or to go out and purchase any permits that are needed. And the airline market joined with some exceptions for that second phase. So moving to the next slide. At this point, now there's a change away from this in the following phase, but we had each member state set up its own national allocation plan of how it was going to allocate its permits. It had an individual registry that would issue permits as well. Interestingly, we've hit some really difficult legal issues around this because these permits are a creation of European level regulation, but actually working out the property rights that attach to these depends on which state those permits were issued. And that's very, very tricky when you do structured trades and you look at taking security over these permits, of working out what are the underlying security issues depend on, and how do you do that can depend on where the particular emissions allowances were issued. But moving along to the next page, please. There were also online records that were set up, and it became a much more complex arrangement, something with a much better infrastructure underpinning it. As a very quick side story about this period, there was a theft of permits from the Romanian registry. I believe the fire alarm had gone off, everybody had left the building, they came back in and they found that the permits registry had been hacked. And we had various clients coming to us saying, we've bought some fraudulent permits. What are our rights in relation to these? And it was quite a complicated issue to work out what the property rights were. But moving to the next slide. We had a community independent transaction which allowed trading between the different member states was introduced. And for moving to our next slide, please. And the way this worked for the compliance period was that March the 31st of each year was the key date. So at the beginning of each year, an affected installation received its set the number of allowances for the year, and it had this 1 year period where it would be measuring the amount of pollution, and it had to surrender its allowances by April the 30th of the next year, or would be hit with this 100 euros per missing allowance. So on to my next slide, please. This then moved us to the phase 3, 2013 to 2020. We moved away from having these national registries, so no more problems of fire alarms going off in local registries. We moved away from some of the issues that were affecting of the property rights that were related, although there are still significant issues that we have to deal with. And on to the next page, please. That then has taken us to this new phase 4. So this is why we think the market's going to get much more active. There are going to be fewer allowances out there. That is going to drive up trading opportunities. And the new phase starts at the beginning of next year. So we are very close, and there are going to be progressively fewer allowances on each year. So that's going to make it more attractive to be involved in CDM projects, in JI projects, and in trading, in the emissions trading in the EU. So on to the next page, please. So this is our underlying asset. When I always explain derivatives, I say water is a derivative, and I say it is a financial instrument, which is, in the case of OTC derivatives, is an option, a swap, or a forward, and it references an underlying asset. So our underlying asset are the emissions trading units, which we have spoken about so far. Well, our financial instruments, of course, they can be straightforward options, either a put or a call option. Very handy for an installation to know that it can purchase allowances at an agreed price at a future date to reduce any risk, or if it knows that it is actually going to be able to reduce its emissions and it will have a surplus of permits, it can be helpful to be able to lock in that profit with a put option. So moving to my next slide, please. Forwards, exactly the same principle. Instead of it being an option to call or an option to put, having a lock-in, being able to sell or buy permits at a agreed price at a future date and have that absolutely locked in, of course, is every bit as useful in emissions credit as it will be in equities and other underlying assets. And moving to our next slide, please. Swaps. Now, swaps might seem a bit of an odd one to have. What is there to swap after all? Well, because there is quite a fraud risk with certified emission reductions and emission reduction units, the ones that have been created from these projects in other countries, those allowances tend to trade at a discount because there's a risk that if a fraud's discovered or there's a fault in the verification process, individual projects will not bring in the resulting credits that are planned or will result in annulment. So if you've entered into an option to buy CERs or ERUs and it turns out that those don't materialize, then you could be at a risk that you won't be able to get those permits in, or you'll have to go out into a market if this is proved widespread and it's pushed up the trading price of permits. So there's often some sort of swaps traded by some institutions between the relative prices of CERs and ERUs, or CERs and EU emissions allowances. So this is quite an interesting and active area for trading desk of emissions trading desks at financial institutions. On to my next slide, please. We also have, we've talked about the financial instruments. Well, what are they traded under? These can be traded under 3 different master agreements. An ISDA master agreement, one by AITA and one by EFET as well, with 2 of the other trading organizations. And we're going to look at that in a moment. They all have ISDA, for example, we'll look at, they have a supplement to the commodity derivative definitions that covers emissions units. There is trading on climate exchanges as well. 10 European exchanges are trading carbon futures. Next slide, please. Carbon pools, which are between affected installations, which match buy and sell orders and are done on an anonymous, can be done on an anonymous basis. These are a good way for affected installations to trade surplus and shortfalls of emissions allowances. Increasingly, banks issuing structured notes which hold emissions allowances as collateral and then have a related forward contract in those, allowing the banks to access emissions allowance at an agreed price at a future date, which can then be traded in the market. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, our 3 trading platforms, ISDA, AITA and EFET, with AITA being one of the specific trade bodies for trading emissions trading credits, EFET being the European Federation of Energy Traders. They have standardized their documentation between them with some small differences. Next slide, please. ISDA, the way it works, you have the master agreement you will all know and love. You would have a confirmation where one incorporates the commodity derivative definitions, use your standard credit support annex, and we have a schedule, part 6, to the commodity derivative definitions, which sets out specific terms for dealing in EU emissions or US emissions. Now, on to the next slide, please. The areas that covers in this sub-annex of the commodity derivative definitions, how you buy, sell, and physically settle transactions, the fallbacks, what happens when your counterparty does not deliver the allowances that are promised, how much must be compensated? Is it the replacement costs of the emissions, or is it the fine that has to be paid? And these are things that are negotiated, and there are standard provisions for doing that in the commodity derivative definitions. On to the next page. There are also fallbacks for, in addition to failure to deliver, what happens if the scheme is suspended or there are settlement disruption provisions. Next page, please. And various elections which can be made as to who pays what for any failure. So this is something that's that this schedule is extracted from the commodity derivatives definitions. It is done as an amendment, placed as an amendment on the parties' ISDA master agreement, so that there can be a relatively straightforward confirmation that is used for trading emissions credits. On to my next page. The documentation for AITA and EFET is fairly similar. There are a few differences to do with force majeure, settlement and disruption, payment and delivery dates, but it's broadly similar provisions, albeit that these are on the master agreement for those particular organizations. What we tend to find is where banks are trading with each other, they want to do it under an ISDA. Where a bank is facing an industry installation, the industry installation will prefer to do this on their normal industry association trading documentation. And that has finished my section, and I defer to Matt to talk about the US ETS.
Thanks, Ed. Great foundation, very informative, and I love your graphics. Very strategic and very well placed on the slides. Great to be here. Welcome, everyone. My name is Matt Kluchenik, partner in the Chicago office. Although pre-COVID, spent a lot of time traveling to other offices, DC and New York in particular, and elsewhere. And again, great to be here. So briefly, I'm going to chat just a word or two about US ETS, the framework, and then jump into the regulatory environment with respect to the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is a regulator that in the past at least and recently has expressed some real interest with respect to environmental commodities. And when we think of where there might be some action going forward from a federal regulatory perspective, the CFTC certainly will be a key player. So in the U.S., with respect to ETSs, as this slide notes, the U.S., from a federal perspective, has lagged pretty significantly behind the EU. No surprise to anyone. That being said, things have been relatively robust at the state level, and in California in particular, with its cap and trade system and its market and significant participation. And we've seen that grow significantly over the past, what has it been, number of years, I want to say 7, 8 years in earnest. Out of that, we've seen a relatively meaningful futures market form. Some of you may know ICE Futures trades a number of futures contracts based upon CCAs, and those, again, very, very actively traded. As we see now a change in administration here in the U.S., it's certainly possible, and I think some would say likely, that we will make significant gains toward a federal ETS, and that will be certainly an impactful development if and when that occurs. And when that occurs, or if and when that occurs, we may well be back to talk about in a little bit more detail the implications of such a regime. So let's move now to the next slide, please, and talk a little bit about the CFTC. It's an independent federal regulator, much like the Securities and Exchange Commission, but while the SEC regulates securities, the CFTC regulates exclusively commodity interests. And so just a brief primer here. When we think about what is a commodity interest, a couple of different things. Number one, there needs to be a commodity involved. As the name says, commodity, very, very broad definition under the federal statute, the Commodity Exchange Act. In a nutshell, a commodity really is just about everything except onions and motion pictures. And you may ask, well, why are there two carve-outs for onions and motion pictures? And that's largely for political reasons, going back to the 1950s and then 2010 with respect to motion pictures. Just about everything else is or can be a commodity. There's a number of carve-outs for securities and certain things here and there, but the definition is very, very broad. And when we think of things like emission credits and RECs and so on and so forth, I think those are, by all accounts, would be viewed to be commodities. So just because something's a commodity, though, it doesn't mean the CFTC can regulate it. The CFTC regulates what we call commodity interests. And so going back to Ed's a few slides ago, when we think of commodity interests, we're thinking about things like swap contracts, futures, retail leveraged commodity transactions, and a few other things. So if we have a transaction where the underlying asset is a commodity, such as a carbon credit, and then we have a financial contract, an instrument such as a swap or a futures contract that's based upon the underlying commodity, we then have a product generally subject to the regulation of the CFTC. And the implications are that base distinction are really significant because commodity interests are subject to extensive regulation by the CFTC, things like registration, capital, reporting, so on and so forth, whereas forward transactions, which are not commodity interests, which we'll discuss this in a little bit, and spot transactions, also not commodity interests, generally are not subject to regulation by the CFTC. That being said, a really brief caveat here from an enforcement perspective. If the CFTC becomes aware of fraud in connection with a commodity transaction, even where there's no commodity interest involved, and we've seen this a lot recently with respect to Bitcoin transactions, other cryptocurrency transactions involving spot commodities, the CFTC has anti-fraud authority to prosecute those transactions. And so similarly here, if there were fraud in connection with, say, a bilateral carbon credit transaction, and there was an element or an allegation of fraud, then the CFTC would have a basis to pursue an enforcement action. That being said, it cannot impose substantive regulation on the parties and the transaction. Let's go to the next slide, please. So on the next couple of slides, I want to focus a little bit on why we care about the CFTC when we talk about environmental commodities. And the CFTC, along with the SEC back in 2011, now this was just after the Dodd-Frank Act had been passed in July of 2010, so about a year before this joint product release, the agencies talked about a lot of different products and the implications from a regulatory perspective of a host of products as a result of the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act. And one of those products or types of products were environmental commodities. And so there was a relatively lengthy discussion on what the CFTC expected the treatment of environmental commodities to be. And that was helpful and everything, but guess what happened? Things got kind of quiet from a regulatory perspective. There really wasn't much said by the CFTC in the years following with respect to the treatment of environmental commodities. And so as we sit here today and as we, recently sit here and issues arise or questions arise, and we often get questions about, we're thinking about marketing or creating, innovating, or doing a transaction involving a certain type of carbon credit. We're unclear if the CFTC might treat this as a forward contract or a swap contract. What do we do? Unfortunately, at least at this stage, we really kind of have to go back to the guidance provided all the way back to 2011, and the market certainly developed a lot since then, and use that as our baseline and think about how the CFTC would likely react. But there has been an uptick in CFTC interest. And so this has been largely at the commissioner level, and that's now in contrast to the commission as a whole. There really hasn't been any formal commission action with respect to environmental commodities, but we have had some commissioners, and one in particular, become very, very active in terms of talking about the need for the CFTC to be dialed into climate initiatives, climate change initiatives, and the role of derivatives. And if we can go to the next slide here. There was a committee convened and sponsored by Commissioner Benham, and this committee brought together a number of market participants late last year, and it ultimately culminated in a very detailed report called Managing Climate Risk in the U.S. Financial System that focused largely on the role or potential role of derivatives in connection with climate change initiatives. And Benham, in introducing the report, made the statement there to serve the long-term need for price discovery and risk mitigation. The derivatives industry must provide new and innovative products focused on climate risk. And to that end, the report, which is a report of a committee convened by the CFTC, so not actually the CFTC itself, made a number of, I think, really important and useful recommendations. First one, there were several, but I'm going to focus on two here. The first one is along the lines that financial regulators generally, and certainly the CFTC, should establish climate finance labs or regulatory sandboxes to enhance the development of derivatives products. When we hear terms finance labs or regulatory sandboxes, those terms have been around for a long time, but we really recently have seen those concepts used extensively in connection with cryptocurrencies and trying to think about, as we have innovative products or we want to spur development with respect to innovation and at the same time model appropriate regulation, this is a potentially useful framework for promoting that. The next slide, please. So another recommendation or series of recommendations in order to further spur or promote interest in this area. The report recommended a survey of market participants. This might be traders, it might be funds, it might be global companies, emitters, so on and so forth, and basically talk to them about their use of climate-related derivatives, whether or not there's sufficient risk management tools out there in the form of derivatives. Also to consider, and this is potentially a large one, targeted exemptions where needed to help facilitate coordination with other regulators, and again, more generally promote the development of these products. Discussion and analysis around alternative execution methods and venues. We certainly saw this in the swaps context with the creation of swap execution facilities. Maybe there's something that can work with respect to environmental commodities. And then ever important, their recommendation to try to coordinate with other regulators so we can avoid so much, quite frankly, from my perspective at least, the fragmentation and piecemeal effect and the piecemeal approach, I guess I should say, with respect to things like crypto assets. Next slide, please. And we're going to dig a little bit more into CFTC perspectives on environmental commodities. But before we do that, just to kind of briefly summarize, so back in 2011, we had some really helpful comment. Things went extremely quiet, at least with respect to the CFTC and most other financial regulators. But now we're seeing an uptick over the past year in terms of an interest not only in these types of products, but potentially regulation around them. And with the change, impending change in administration, I think it's certainly likely that that will only accelerate the interest, and environmental commodities are likely to become a priority and a real focus of the agency going forward. I'm not going to repeat everything on this slide, as Ed so ably covered it, distinctions between swaps, forwards, and spots. But a key consideration here with respect to commodities, environmental commodities, is, as noted, do we have a swap or do we have a forward contract? When we think of a spot contract, that's all relatively standard. You know, Ed sells me a credit, I pay for it. We have, you know, readily thereafter ownership is transferred, and we have a basic spot transaction, which is, you know, the bulk of the market. But let's say, you know, we have a purchase and sale arrangement. Delivery is materially deferred, delayed, maybe for many months, maybe for many years. In the U.S., where the parties intend to make and take delivery, ultimately, we would think about that as a forward contract, but there could be some interesting embedded tools or features to that. There might be an embedded option. There might be a cancellation right, and we can kind of get into issues. Well, this looks like it should be a forward, but maybe it's actually a swap. And again, the implication to that is really large, because if it's a swap, it's now a regulated transaction. Participants have to be regulated, whereas if it's a forward transaction, that would not be the case. And so looking at forward contract exclusion generally, in terms of does the transaction come out, the Dodd-Frank, and let's jump, if we can, to the next slide for purposes of timing. We think about three elements to the transaction. Do we have a non-financial commodity, which is the case with respect to environmental commodities, deferred shipment or delivery? That might be the case. And then do we have an intent to physically deliver the non-financial commodity? As a general matter, if we have those three elements, then we would have a forward contract not subject to substantive CFTC regulation. On the next slide, please. So with environmental commodities, though, the CFTC went a step further. And it's a really, really important step further in terms of this forward or swap distinction. And so they issued, as part of that rulemaking, an interpretation, which I've quoted below, and I'll briefly read. It says the CFTC is providing an interpretation that an intangible commodity, including an environmental commodity, which can be physically delivered, that would include an electronic transfer, for example, on a register, qualifies as a non-financial commodity if ownership of the commodity can be conveyed in some manner. Transfer of title, no big deal, and the commodity can be consumed. And that consumption piece is a new element. The next slide, please. And so the CFTC further expounded that those two features, ownership transfer and consumption of something like a carbon credit, distinguish environmental commodity transactions from other types of intangible commodity transactions that can't be delivered, things like temperatures, interest rates, and a bunch of other things. And so they ultimately took the approach that environmental commodities can, in fact, be viewed analytically like products, physical products such as wheat and gold, which, as the next slide shows, means that ultimately, as we think about, do we have a forward contract or do we have a swap contract, we're really looking at three components. Is there an intent to deliver? Is there transfer of ownership? And then is there consumption? And so back to our transaction, the transaction I do with Ed, the parties intend to make and take delivery. We transfer ownership. If I'm the purchaser, though, and my ultimate intent is not to consume, but rather say to sell that credit to, we'll take Melissa here, then that brings into question whether or not we have a forward contract. And as we go to the next slide, if I'm, in a nutshell, not using that credit for environmental compliance or claim purposes, then arguably, based upon the guidance, it appears that we would not have a forward contract, which means that we have a swap transaction, which again triggers a bunch of regulatory implications. And in the guidance, the 2011, rulemaking, CFTC didn't come out and explicitly said this, but they conveyed it, one might say strongly suggested in so many words, that consumption element with respect to the purchaser is paramount and of critical importance. And on this slide and the next slide, I just referenced some of the comments in support thereof with respect to this notion that there needs to be consumption. So the framework here, it's not altogether 100% clear, but I think the import clearly points in a certain direction. And it's not, ultimately maybe the best guidance for market participants. But I think the reason for optimism here is that we have, a relatively solid baseline in which the CFTC has seriously looked at these types of products. We have a situation now where we're seeing a shift in momentum towards, after a period of delay, increased focus and, frankly, a seeming desire by certain commissioners to really, tune in and try to ensure that derivatives and similar types of products can meet the needs of market participants in the climate change arena. And so I think it's going to be an exciting year or two ahead with respect to environmental commodities. And with that, I see we're at the top of the hour, and I think that concludes my slides.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. My only closing remark is to say that climate change has been an issue for some time. I recall, I've quoted from a book by John Evelyn from 1661 in one of my previous articles, who wrote back in 1661, "The columns and clouds of smoke which are belched forth from the sooty throats of the city's industrial empire made London in a few moments like the picture of Troy sacked by the grouped. Its inhabitants breathed nothing but impure and thick mist accompanied by filthy vapor." Well, John Evelyn proposed creating a green belt and putting the polluting industries outside London. So, and he thought that by doing that, you could build more expensive apartments in the city of London. So even 400 years ago, climate change could potentially be used for profits and for trading. So with that, I will finish and say thank you very much to everybody for tuning in. Thank you very much to Matt, and bid you all a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.